Hello, my name is Yseult O'Driscoll, and you're very welcome to the Hugh Lane Gallery series of online talks. Today, as part of our Coffee Conversation series, we're going to look at this piece of sculpture called Glendalough by Beatrice Elvery, or, as she later became known after she got married, Lady Beatrice Glenavy. Now, Beatrice Elvery was a talented Irish artist with a long career, stretching from the early years of the 20th century up until close to her death in 1970. And she was very versatile. As well as painting, she was also well known as a book illustrator and stained glass artist, as well as producing several sculptures like this one, which were highly thought of. Now, significantly, Beatrice Elvery was, for a time at the beginning of the 20th century, actively involved in the whole Irish revival movement. And her work played a part in the evolution of national consciousness at this time. So before I get on to talking about Beatrice herself, I first want to tell you a bit about the cultural revival movement that developed in Ireland over the course of the late 19th and into the 20th centuries. And the reason for this is that it influenced the nature of Beatrice Elvery's work in the early years of the 20th century, especially in its content. Now, I'll just minimize my screen so as not to distract you, and we'll begin. The cultural revival movement that developed in Ireland in the course of the 19th century was actually part of a wider European trend at the time, which often went hand in hand with the growth of political nationalism. Now, this whole notion of a nation state made up of a distinct race of people with similar ideals and aspirations took off in the aftermath of the French Revolution. And throughout the 19th century, a range of different individual states began to emerge as political and other campaigns for self-determination became more and more prevalent. And the concept of a nation of similar people being governed independently by themselves gradually gained acceptance. Now, hand in hand with political nationalism went cultural nationalism. The idea of constructing or rediscovering a separate and distinct cultural identity to reinforce the political one. Often people searched in the remote past or otherwise among vernacular traditions to find the rationale for doing this. And this activity became in time an important part of nation building. For example, when Norway finally gained its independence from Sweden in 1905, it rediscovered traditional timber forms derived from medieval Nordic culture, and these were then developed into a distinct and recognizable national architectural style, known as dragastil or dragon style. In Ireland, the same as elsewhere, cultural activity went hand in hand with political efforts towards achieving nationhood. In fact, here, cultural activity took the lead, in part due to a continuing lack of progress on the political front. And you might say that in Ireland, the impetus was in the first place to realise a separate cultural identity, which was then used to support the demand for political independence. Efforts were concentrated on distinguishing Irish culture as far as possible from that of Britain, so as to emphasise the differences of Irish people from their colonial masters. In effect, there was a concerted effort to, as it were, de-Anglicise Irish culture and bring it back to its pre-conquest roots. Now, to do this, First of all, people looked back to Ireland's remote heritage before it was ruled by Britain. They sought to draw attention to the remnants of its past, which was generally seen as having been an illustrious one, rich in religion and learning, often shrouded in myth. And they also looked for inspiration to the part of Ireland geographically furthest from Britain, the western seaboard with its rural peasant population, which, it was felt, was the most free from the disrupting influence of British customs and civilization. Now, the evidence of Ireland's illustrious past was available to be seen in the National Museum in Dublin and elsewhere, including examples of early Christian metalwork and illuminated manuscripts such as the Book of Kells, which you can see here. And the activities of antiquarians were also an important source of material for cultural revivalists. George Petrie travelled around the country from the 1840s onwards, recording old customs and the remains of distinctive early Christian architecture, such as galleries or oratory, for example, that you can see here on the left, thus providing further evidence of Ireland's heritage. Now, many of Petrie's drawings and paintings were published as prints, like these ones here, which, for instance, you can see on the top. And this had the effect of bringing them to the notice of more people. And as a result, they helped to raise consciousness of Ireland's rich cultural past. Now, the literary revival movement played a leading role in the whole drive for cultural revival in Ireland. And here you can see some of its leading figures. Writers like W.B. Yeats collected old Irish literature, folk tales, and legends. And Yeats then popularized these in his poems and plays. Then the playwright John Millington Synge travelled out to Connemara and the Aran Islands to get close to the people living there. And he wrote plays set in the remote West based on his experience. These were in turn put on at the Abbey Theatre, which had been set up by W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory for the purpose of bringing Irish drama to Irish audiences. At the same time, Douglas Hyde and others founded the Gaelic League with the aim of reviving the Irish language and promoting Irish culture. Now, the literary revival movement wasn't, however, the only group involved in forging an Irish identity in this period. At the same time, there were efforts to provide a visual expression of the Irish culture that the members of the literary movement had uncovered or were reimagining. Initially, at least, these efforts were confined to the applied arts or arts and crafts rather than the fine arts. And this is because applied arts were generally seen as being more amenable to being used to express nationalist ideas. Also, fine arts in Ireland at that time were seen as being closely associated with the traditions of the Royal Academy in London, and therefore too tied up with British culture. Now, one of the bodies most active in efforts to reinvigorate Ireland's material culture was the arts and crafts movement. Now, the arts and crafts movement was originally founded in England by William Morris and then spread across Europe and into North America at the end of the 19th century. It marked an important period in Ireland's cultural history. It was originally set up to counter the effects of the Industrial Revolution in England, and it championed the rights of workers and celebrated craftsmanship and the handmade over mass-produced goods. Most significantly for Ireland, however, which didn't have an industrial revolution, it also promoted distinct regional styles and encouraged an awareness and appreciation of local heritage. In Ireland, the arts and crafts movement was as much about social, political, and cultural ideas as it was about making things. And it effectively provided a visual counterpart to the literary revival movement. In fact, the two groups were often allied by way of networks of friends or family connections, especially. For example, in 1902, W.B. Yeats's sisters, Lily and Elizabeth, together with Evelyn Gleason, founded Dun Emer Industries, an arts and crafts cooperative for women, which made embroidery panels and tapestries, and also ran a printing press, producing collections of Yeats's poetry. And you can see a photograph of the workshop here on the left, on top. Now, taking its cue from the Irish literary revival, the arts and crafts movement looked for inspiration to rural Ireland and the country's ancient heritage. The Arts and Crafts Society of Ireland was set up by Lord Mayo in 1894 in order to promote the development of rural craft industries such as lacework and crochet, along with activities like stained glass making, often using traditional designs copied from examples of insular art and artifacts in the National Museum. Then they organised exhibitions of these crafts, both in Dublin and internationally, to showcase Irish craftwork abroad. And this had the effect of drawing attention to a distinctively Irish style. Now, as I said above, the interest in revitalising Irish culture led to efforts to revive the Irish language and recover forgotten Irish folktales and legends. And many artists were closely involved in these projects, most especially those producing illustrations for popular books and magazines, which helped to disseminate Irish culture among the general public. And they also contributed to efforts to promote the idea of the Irish as a separate and distinct race, which became a feature of the political nationalist movement which emerged at the same time. For example, Jack B. Yeats travelled with John Millington Synge to the west of Ireland and provided illustrations for his book, The Aran Islands, such as this one here on the left, an island horseman, for example. Sean Campbell, then, an artist and illustrator from Belfast, also produced works celebrating the Irish rural community. And drawings such as Mary of Carrick, here on the right, presented a romantic picture of the Irish peasant, integrated into and part of a landscape that was essentially different from the English one. Now, this brings us on to Beatrice Elvery herself and her work. Here's a photograph of her from 1905, alongside her portrait by William Orpin from 1909. She was born in Dublin in 1883, the second of 7 children. Her father owned the very well-known Elvery sporting goods stores in the city. Now, the family could trace its origins back to Spain, where they had been silk merchants and had links to the Sephardic Jewish community there. They migrated in the 18th century to England, seemingly changing their name from Alvarez to Elvery along the way. A branch of the family moved to Ireland in the late 1840s, and the first Elvery's shop was opened in Sackville Street, which is now, of course, O'Connell Street, in Dublin in the 1850s. Now, the Elvery family were both musical and artistic, especially on Beatrice's mother's side. Teresa Moss had attended the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art, while her sister, Beatrice's aunt, Phoebe Traquair, was a leading light in the Scottish Arts and Crafts Society, famous for her embroidery panels and mural paintings. And Beatrice's sister, Dorothy, was also an artist. She practiced for the most part in South Africa. She emigrated when she was a young woman and got married there, becoming Dorothy Kay. Now, here's a painting of the Elvery family by Dorothy from the 1930s. And if you look closely, you can see a version of Orpin's portrait of Beatrice hanging in the background in the centre. Beatrice won a scholarship to the Dublin Metropolitan School in 1896, and she was just 13. Now, she was a very good student and won the Taylor Prize on 3 occasions. It seems that she immediately took to modelling in clay, which she enjoyed greatly, and she became a star of the sculpture school. She even considered for a while becoming a professional sculptor. She was very versatile, however, and went on to work in many different medias, producing book illustrations and fine art paintings, as well as stained glass work. Now, Beatrice's family wasn't wealthy. She had been obliged to get scholarships to fund her education, and she had to make a living for herself, which she did by teaching at the Dublin Metropolitan School, as well as producing book illustrations and even designs for silverware. In around 1904, Sarah Purser invited her to join on Tour Glynna. As part of the Irish Arts and Crafts Initiative, Purser had set up on Tour Glynna in 1903 as a stained glass workshop, with the aim of improving the standard of religious stained glass art in the country. Now, Beatrice agreed, although it necessitated her going back to the Metropolitan School to retrain as a stained glass artist. She later said that she regretted taking up stained glass work and claimed that she had loathed it. However, she worked for some years with Tour Glynna and produced several church windows. For example, this resurrection window from the Church of Ireland in Stradbally, which unusually includes a representation of Mary Magdalene. Beatrice was very popular and sociable and got to know many of the leading lights of artistic Dublin, such as the Yeats family and George Moore and George Bernard Shaw even. She also knew Hugh Lane, who, it seems, asked her for a contribution for his new Dublin gallery. Now, she didn't, in fact, in the end, provide anything, however, because, as she wrote to him, she felt that she had nothing that was good enough. She was the muse for Oliver Shepherd's Roisin Dubh, or Dark Rosaleen, on the base of his James Clarence Mangan Memorial, which you can see here. And she was also a model for William Orpin, her teacher at the Metropolitan School. He painted her portrait twice. One of them you've already seen. It seems that she met many of these people through Sarah Purser, whose at-homes she used to attend. Now, it's through her contacts on the Dublin artistic and literary scene that Beatrice became attracted to the romantic appeal of Celtic nationalism. And this is despite her loyalist Anglo-Irish Protestant family background. In due course, she came to know several of those associated with nationalist politics. And she produced this painting, which you can see here on the left, called Éire, after seeing Maud Gonne in Yeats's play Kathleen Ní Húlacháin. This is a deeply symbolic picture. It's in the format of a traditional Madonna and Christ Child religious painting. And the central hooded figure, which was modelled on Maud Gonne, is a representation of Ireland in female form. A mother figure sheltering her children under the folds of her cloak. The child that she's carrying on her knee, who's beckoning to the viewer, might represent the new Ireland, bathed in light, while behind her is a shadowy crowd of saints, evoking Ireland's early fame as the island of saints and scholars. Now, the picture incorporates many of the distinctive Irish art forms that had been popularised as part of the Celtic Revival movement, such as the high cross at the figure's back and the Tara brooch at her breast, which you can just see there. The woman in Éire is, in effect, an image of the nation personified. And the personification of the nation as a woman was, in fact, a popular device used to instill national pride or impart a sense of nationhood. For example, Marianne in France or Britannia in England. So Beatrice Elvery's era could be described as an Irish equivalent to these symbols. When Maud Gonne saw era, she immediately voted for St Enda's, Padraig Pearse's school in the Ranelagh suburb of Dublin. And it hung alongside the painting on the right called Yseult O'Driscoll, or the Child Jesus, which was commissioned for the school directly from Beatrice. This larger-than-life painting of what is effectively a holy boy warrior reflected Pearse's philosophy, combining religion with militant nationalism. Both of these paintings inspired revolutionary fervour in many of the school's students, and Beatrice was later shocked to learn from a former pupil of St Enda's that her paintings had made him want to go out and join the Easter Rising in 1916. Now, she also provided illustrations for Pearse's collection of Irish short stories called Yseult O'Driscoll agus Scéalta Ella. And Pearse used to visit her in her studio at Glendalough to translate into English the stories that he wanted her to illustrate, as she knew no Irish. As well as illustrations, she also designed the book's cover, and you can see both of them here. Beatrice did a lot of illustration work at this time, particularly for children's books, where she produced imagery popularizing the message of the cultural revival movement. For example, she illustrated Violet Russell's collection of children's stories, Heroes of the Dawn, with dramatic line drawings and romantic coloured representations of mythological Irish heroes like Finn McCool, such as these two that you can see here. Now, in these ways, Beatrice Elvery's work was co-opted into the Irish nationalist cause. She also produced designs for the Coola press, which were often made into greetings or Christmas cards. And these tended to promote a particular vision of Irishness, founded on rural Catholic peasant ideals of motherhood and the land. For example, this print here, The Virgin Ironing, presents an ideal of Irish motherhood based on the Blessed Virgin. It's, as it were, a biblical story, but updated for a modern context. Now, this print strikes me as being almost a propaganda image, an expression in popular form of an ideal society based on rural conservative Catholic values. It's a worldview as far away as you could imagine from the sophistication of turn-of-the-century urban centres like London, or even Dublin, where Beatrice's romanticised vision of rural Ireland is at marked odds with the picture presented in, for example, James Joyce's Dubliners, which appeared at around the same time. Now let's now turn to look at today's work, Glendalough, from around 1904. First, I want to talk very briefly about Beatrice's sculpture in general. Now, as I said earlier, she was the star of the sculpture department at the Dublin Metropolitan School. In fact, she was so talented that her teacher there, John Hughes, tried to persuade her to travel to Paris and join Rodin's workshop to learn stone carving. However, it seems that her parents were vehemently opposed to this, so she refused in the end. Now, she produced a whole range of arts and crafts style sculpture, including busts, bas-relief plaques and panels, and even a lectern for a local church in Dublin. You can see some of these here. Generally, she wasn't able to afford to have her work cast in bronze, so it tended to be made in plaster or terracotta. She exhibited several of her works at the Arts and Crafts exhibition in Dublin, where they were admired for their strong, simple lines. For example, this one, called Mother, an Irish peasant, virgin and child, which she showed in the 1904 exhibition. Now, Glendalough is a small-scale work, only 12 centimetres or about 5 inches high. It was apparently inspired by a visit that Beatrice made with some friends to Glendalough, where they took a boat out onto the lake in the evening. She was impressed by the stillness and silence of the atmosphere on the lake. And she also had what she described as an extraordinary sense of something brooding over the site, which she then tried to express in her piece. Modelled in plaster, it's a stylized depiction of a woman's head and hair, its sinuous, fluid lines suggesting water. Perhaps she's the personification of some sacred guardian of the lake. Now, there's several little naked figures clinging to her hair, and these might represent the 7 churches of Glendalough. So it evokes the ancient monastic site with its mystical overtones, harking back to Ireland's rich early Christian heritage, something that was of great interest to those involved in cultural revival at the time. The piece could also be interpreted as a woman mourning her drowned children, whose naked bodies are tangled in her hair. Perhaps a symbol of Ireland's sad, suffering past circumstances, the flowing lines expressing an emotional turmoil. And this would chime with the romantic nationalism that was beginning to inspire Beatrice's work at this time. This is a symbolist piece, probably the most symbolist of Beatrice Elvery's sculptures. It's more the expression of an idea than it is a representation of anything concrete. Symbolism, which had its heyday at the end of the 19th century, inspired literature as well as art, influencing much of W.B. Yeats's poetry, for example. Symbolist works tend to be dreamlike and enigmatic, evoking myths and legends, with nothing as it appears on the surface. And many artists working in Ireland at the time who became caught up in the whole romantic nationalist climate turned to symbolism to express themselves, probably trying to portray a feeling of affinity or sympathy with an undefined or vague romantic idea. Now, this work falls into that category and was probably Beatrice's response to Irish revolutionary politics and the passionate aspirations of her nationalist friends. Either way, it's an enigmatic and highly romantic piece. Now, Beatrice finally abandoned both sculpture and stained glass for good in 1910. She travelled to London to study at the Slade School, where unfortunately she only lasted a single term and was quite unhappy. It seems that her teachers there, especially Henry Tonks, considered that her work was far too academic and out of touch with modernist ideas. And it's true that she never embraced expressionism or other artistic innovations like cubism that were by now entering the mainstream of European art practice. In 1912, at the age of 32, Beatrice Elvery married Gordon Campbell, an Anglo-Irish barrister, and the couple moved to London, where he'd been called to the bar. Now here, as in Dublin, she also mixed in intellectual circles, becoming friends with D.H. Lawrence and the New Zealand writer Catherine Mansfield, for example. The family moved back to Dublin after the First World War, and now Beatrice became very much a member of the establishment. Her husband was secretary to the Ministry of Industry and Commerce in the Irish Free State, while her father-in-law was created Lord Glenavy in 1921. As a result of their connections, the family became a target during the Civil War, culminating in the burning down of their house in 1922. In 1931, her husband inherited his father's title, and Beatrice became known as Lady Glenavy. After 1916, she resolutely turned her back on revolutionary politics, repelled by what she saw as its descent into violence. It's ironic then, in a way, that works such as Éire and Iseult are often seen as important symbols of the Irish nationalist struggle for independence. Now, Beatrice returned to work after the birth of her 3 children and continued to paint throughout her marriage. However, she now abandoned revolutionary themes and instead concentrated almost solely on producing symbolist and at times quirky images, including still lifes and landscapes. Now, the Hugh Lane Gallery has 2 of these, which you can see here. Some of her later work wasn't always well received in Ireland, probably a reflection of the increasingly conservative character of the state as the century progressed. For example, this painting from 1931 called The Intruder. It's a somewhat provocative work featuring a female centaur galloping through a dreamlike surrealist landscape. It was exhibited in London at the Royal Academy, where it was well received, even being caricatured in Punch magazine under the title The Homewrecker. In Ireland, however, the reaction was much more muted, and a suggestion that it be bought for one of the country's public collections was turned down on the basis that it was obscene, possibly a reference to the 2 naked women embracing in the background, as well as the overall theme. Much of Beatrice Elvery's later work has an almost surreal appearance, suggesting a fantasy world, detached and remote. For example, this painting from the 1950s called The Unicorn. It portrays a distant, fantastic dream world, completely removed from reality, like an illustration from a child's fairy story. It's a very decorative and escapist painting with its soft colours and dreamy atmosphere, and quite out of touch with the artistic mainstream in the 1950s. Beatrice was elected to the RHA in 1934 and exhibited there almost every year up until her death in 1970 at the age of 87. And her son, Patrick Campbell, would go on to become a well-known columnist for both the Irish Times and the Sunday Times. So there you have the story of Beatrice Glenavy and this quite unusual sculpture, which I think provides an interesting reflection of her romantic and idealist attachment to Irish nationalist aspirations at the beginning of the 20th century. And I hope you'll be able to come into the gallery sometime soon and maybe even see it yourselves and see what you think. Thank you very much for listening to me, and goodbye.